Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Milo Wolf. And I told him I was going to use his name interchangeably, probably from Milo and Milo. So I already, apologize for that. But Milo, he's currently pursuing his PhD on the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy and strength. And he has been a coach for over 4 years. And he's known as the ROM guy right now, range of motion guy. So very excited to have you on. And yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Dude, it's an honor. Big fan of the name of the podcast, Mind Muscle Connection. Very clever. I'm jealous. But yeah, very happy to get on here and talk about range of motion.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. And as far as the name goes, the Mind Muscle Connection, that was one that I had to get some help with, but I really liked it because it was like, I like the Mind Muscle Connection, but also it's like the mind, I want to kind of train the mind as well too with this podcast. So that was kind of the interplay there with it. But yeah, again, really excited to have you on about range of motion. I know that this is something that is really hot topic right now in fitness industry, particularly, if you're trying to build muscle and whatnot. So again, really looking forward to diving into this. But first, before we dive into that, do you mind just maybe sharing, kind of your background with fitness and, maybe some things that you enjoy about like what you do in your, with fitness and things like that?
100%. So the main reason I've probably been invited on this podcast to begin with is because I'm doing my PhD in sports science on range of motion and the effects it has on muscle hypertrophy and strength. Before that, I did an undergrad in sports science, just, learning my stuff a little bit. But the reason I studied sports science in the first place is because when I was around 14, 15, so about 8 years ago now, I got into lifting weights. I stopped playing soccer, I guess you would call it. And was looking for something else to do instead. And I'd always done those push-ups and bicep curls in my room at night when no one was watching. And the idea of being muscular and strong appealed to me, got into lifting. And then when I had to pick what to study at university, I was like, to be honest, nothing really compares in terms of appeal and the passion I have for it as lifting does. And so for a few years, I've been reading stuff on Stronger by Science, or I've been listening to podcasts and stuff. And so sports science seemed like a natural choice. Went and studied sports science at Loughborough, did my undergrad, came to do my PhD at Solent University in Southampton in England. And I'm currently 2 years into my PhD on the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy and strength. Besides that, I've also competed in powerlifting once and in bodybuilding once, did very averagely, even though that's not a word, in both, but had the experience, enjoyed both to a decent extent. But I would say I more so classify myself as a quote unquote off-season or amateur bodybuilder. So
I can totally relate to that too. I've competed a couple times myself, and right now it's just like you said, it's more off season, just trying to put on some muscle right now. And it's like, maybe sometime in the future, but really like no definite plan. So I guess for you, is that kind of your game plan right now is just like maybe just keep adding some muscle and then potentially compete down the line at some point?
Absolutely. So for reference, when I've competed once in bodybuilding. I competed in the men's open class tall bodybuilding. And so for a first-time competitor, that's a decently hard class, especially in the UK. So from what I've heard, people usually say that shows in the US, there's a lot of shows going around, right? And so the standard at some shows tends to be relatively lower. But in the UK, especially after COVID, people put off competing in bodybuilding for years because there were no shows. That show had a really high standard to the point that, like, first of all, I got last, but second of all, I sent those pictures to some people like Dr. Mike Isbertel, for example. And his first question before I even said anything was like, was that show tested? Because like the people who got first and second, especially in my class, were very muscular and very, very lean. Like I'm talking fully striated glutes, completely striations in lower back, everything. So, and also just to give you an idea of sort of muscularity we're talking about here, the first guy I think has deadlifted like 350 for a rep. So that's in kilograms. So it's around like
a lot of weight,
770 pounds or something. So yeah, but some very strong, lean, muscular people. So yeah, I'd say I'm more so an off-season bodybuilder for the time being. The feedback I got to the show was literally, you just need to be better overall. Like you don't have any weaknesses in terms of symmetry, but overall, just come in next time with more muscle, more conditioning, more everything, which is kind of unhelpful feedback, right? Because like, okay, yeah, I was going to try and get better anyways. But yeah, it was a great show anyways. It was in the WMBF. And so now the plan, I competed last year, is just to add some muscle for a few years and then hopefully come back to the stage more improved. And the reason I'm taking a few years off as well is because competing can wreak havoc on your relationship with food, with eating, with your body to an extent. But for me, I think taking a few years off to build some muscle and fix all that up a little bit makes sense.
And it's just such a long process too. You think for me, like before I got really kind of into more of the like science side of things, and when I first started competing, it was like, oh, you can change your physique a ton in like a year. But it's like, and I'm sure if you go from, you're newer to it, but man, I'll tell you what, it's just, that's not enough time, right? You really need a lot of time there to really add muscle. And it's just such a slow freaking process there. But your judges' feedback was very similar to mine too. My first couple shows too. I remember my very first one, I got feedback from the judge and it was just soft. I was like, okay, well, I don't really know what to do with that. But like you said, you just kind of have to just basically do the same thing, just get bigger and get more conditioned and everything like that. So for you then, what does kind of training look like for you now? Do you have like, I guess maybe how many days a week are you training? And then do you kind of still run, even though you're in the off season, your main goal is to add muscle? Do you still maybe run some like fat loss phases in between there and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now my training is 5 days a week, relatively higher frequencies by most people's standards. So I'd say I'm training most muscle groups between around three times a week, to be honest. But that is very much compartmentalizing exercise selection. So I'll do like an exercise that I primarily deem to hit the quads. Right. So if I'm training quads, let's say 3 times a week, in reality, it might be like 4 times a week because there's some crossover from glute work or hamstring work and so forth. But generally, relatively higher frequencies, like 2 to 4 times a week, I'd say, per muscle. 5 days a week total training, Monday through Friday, mostly for lifestyle constraints at the moment. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, I've been busy as hell for the past like a couple of years. It's sort of been steadily ramping up to this point where like now, for example, I can take on many more responsibilities, if any. And training wise, I have to be, okay, I got an hour or an hour and a half, 5 days a week to train. That's it. Otherwise something else takes a big hit. Because before I was training twice a day for 5 days a week sometimes. Like I was doing up to 12 sessions a week sometimes and stuff like that. But recently with my schedule and everything, that's become less feasible. But to be honest, I found a surprisingly similar amount of progress with a 5 days per week approach versus 2 sessions per day approach. Like I think you do run into diminishing returns with twice daily training at some point, such that even just training 5 days a week is pretty good for getting some good gains in hypertrophy and strength.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if it was just more lifestyle constraint or things like that, because I know getting your PhD is very, very time consuming. And then I know you coach as well. So, again, that's another huge time commitment there as well. But you said basically for you, like, you found that almost training 5 days a week was just as good as training, like you said, doing 2 a days and things like that. As far as the frequency goes, is that just an approach that you found over time to be better for you? Or do you think that based on the research, that might be a little bit better of an option for some people to go?
Yeah. So honestly, regarding the research, I think a frequency of somewhere between 2 and 5 times a week per muscle group is pretty much equivalent. I do think most people respond very slightly better to more so towards 3 or 4 times a week. I'm not sure it's a huge difference, to be honest, though. Like it very much requires experimentation, and it might just be down to what frequency allows you to do the most volume per week and still recover, everything else being equal, like same RP on every set, same exercise selection, same everything. What frequency allows you to maximize your volume per muscle group per week and overall for your whole body, right? Because like, sure, maybe a certain frequency allows you to get more quad volume in, but if that's at the expense of hamstring glute volume, maybe it's not the best frequency and so forth. So I think it's probably best to train most muscles between 3 and 4 times a week, I would say, if you want to optimize growth. But there is some individual variation where some people might be best off with twice, maybe once, and some people might be better off even with 5 times a week. So,
well, like you mentioned, there's just so many things that go into it, and we're obviously going to hit on one of them. I think range of motion is going to also play a big role in that as well too, which I'm definitely really excited to hear more about that. So last question on kind of your training and nutrition side of things. I kind of like, so for you, is this still typical, like you're just kind of in a surplus during this time, or are you going to spend some time where you are kind of doing some fat loss dieting as well periodically?
Yeah. So for the most part, I'm in surplus. So I'd say I spend maybe 9 or 10 months of the year in a surplus. And that's a small surplus, enough to gain around 0.5 to 1% of body weight per month. So for me, I'm around 220 pounds. That's around like 1 to 2 pounds a month on average. Um, but yeah, I do occasionally enter fat loss phases. I would say mostly for aesthetic preferences and health reasons. So being a relatively heavy person, not in terms of necessarily in terms of body fat, but just in general, been lifting weights, I do get some mild hypertension if I bulk up too heavy, essentially. So I prefer to stay reasonably lean, but I'm not doing it out of a concern of like optimizing P ratio, as in muscle gain relative to fat gain during the off season. It's more so out of like I look better when I'm slightly leaner. It's better for social media too, for transparency. It's better for health as well. And so that's mostly why I incorporate some fat loss phases, but there's not really a good reason, besides being within reach of stage lean, there's not really a good reason to run too many cuts in the off season as a bodybuilder, because your main goal is to gain muscle mass. So I tend to minimize that compared to being in a consistent surplus, because that can really build momentum. It's a weird term to use, but being consistently in a small surplus week upon week, hitting mostly the same exercises, seeing performance go up and so forth, I feel like that can be quite productive as a bodybuilder in the off season.
Yeah, I agree. There really is something to the momentum aspect of, like you said, being in that small surplus and just staying consistent with it. I think that that's probably where most people go wrong with when it comes to building muscles. I don't think they get that momentum that you kind of hit on there with that. So cool. Love. I just kind of like diving into, I guess, training, nutrition, kind of see, where they're at within. It's always cool to kind of see how people manage it, especially somebody like you that is pursuing their PhD and everything like that as well. So awesome. Let's dive into the topic for why we brought you on. So we are going to talk all about range of motion. Just a couple like little background. I know you recently had a meta-analysis come out. We're obviously going to hit on that a little bit as well. But I guess before we dive into that, I kind of told you this off air, but maybe if you could maybe hit on just like a few key terms here that we might go over throughout this process, just so people kind of have an understanding there of it.
Absolutely. So range of motion, very straightforward. It's essentially just how much motion or movement you go through during a given exercise. It can be defined in one of two ways, usually. The first way is more relevant to hypertrophy training or muscle growth training or general training, which is essentially just how much movement about a joint do you go through during an exercise. Example, during a bicep curl, how much movement occurs about the elbow joint using elbow flexion during that exercise. That's your range of motion. In the strength world, especially in powerlifting, it can also be defined as a sort of distance the bar travels relative to certain anatomical landmarks. So thinking mainly of the squat here, if your hip crease doesn't get to the same depth or below the top of your knee, you don't hit depth. So for strength, the definition is slightly different, but in general, it's just the distance either the barbell travels or the movement about a joint during a given exercise. That's one thing. I think the two other terms that will come in handy to define up front would be muscle length related. So generally, let's say you're doing a bicep curl, right? At the bottom of the bicep curl, your elbow is extended, which means because your biceps is an elbow flexor, your biceps is stretched out. It's a long muscle length, right? At the middle, it's at moderate muscle lengths because it's neither really contracted or really stretched out. So it's around moderate muscle lengths. Finally, when it's at the top, so the very top of bicep curl, well, gym bros and myself colloquially call the peak contraction. That's the shortest muscle length you can achieve, and generally, I guess you can call that peak contraction. That's a fine term to use, I guess. Generally, those are the terms I think are useful to know ahead of time.
Yeah, and then I guess one area, so like to go off that, like the bicep, I think is a really good one to explain, because that's for me, the one that I have the toughest time with would be like shoulders. How would you kind of describe shoulders and like long and short in length there with that?
So the thing with the shoulder joint is that the shoulder is a very, very mobile joint. And there's sort of, I wouldn't call it ongoing debate, but it's not super clear what positions would stretch out what head of the shoulders the most, for example. But generally at the bottom of a cable or dumbbell lateral raise is where you'd see some stretching lateral delts. Maybe at the start of a machine rear delt fly is where you would see, for example, some stretch on the rear delts. And then at the bottom of overhead press, you would see some stretch on the front delts. So with the shoulders, it's a bit more challenging, whereas with a muscle group like, I don't know, the abs, which only act at the spine, or some of those muscle groups, it's a bit easier.
Right. Something like again, the bicep there, the elbow is just like, right. There's just that one is easy to define, whereas the shoulder is a little bit tougher for me to kind of comprehend, but no, that was super helpful. Cool. So yeah, I think those will be super helpful for people to kind of have that in their mind in terms of what long and short is, because I know that there's a lot of research that goes into certain aspects of the range of motion that are important. So let's kind of dive into the current research. I know you recently did a meta-analysis. I think you had Brad Schoenfeld on it. You had a couple other really good authors on it as well. So yeah, if we want to dive into that and maybe just kind of talk about, you know, the reasoning for it and maybe some things that you did within that.
Absolutely. So essentially, we performed a systematic search of all studies where they had two groups or conditions, with one group or condition doing a different range of motion than the other. We did that. We found around 26 studies. All the studies had to measure at least one performance or muscle size or body fat outcome. So some studies only included, for example, a strength outcome, where some studies included a muscle size outcome, a strength outcome, a jumping outcome, and lots of other stuff. Then we took all that data and we did two things. One, we pooled all the numbers to create essentially like a summary of what the data says. So we performed the meta-analysis. And then besides that, we also took all those studies and performed a systematic review, which means basically you walk through each study, describe how the study went, what the results were, to hopefully draw out some trends and also potentially issues with methodology, right? Like with a meta-analysis, you don't really look at methodology too closely, and you might miss out on certain nuances, whereas with systematic review, you're able to look at those a bit more closely, and that can hopefully get you a bit more nuance overall. So we did that, and initially we looked at all outcomes, so not differentiating between muscle size, between strength, between performance, or anything like that. Across all outcomes, a full range of motion was trivially better than a partial range of motion. Now, trivial just means that, you know, in practical terms, you shouldn't expect too big of a difference, all else being equal, when training with one range of motion versus another. But where it gets interesting, in my opinion, is when you take that overall result and break it down into different outcome categories. So for example, what we did is we categorized outcomes into either being a strength outcome, like for example, a squat 1 rep max, or a muscle size outcome, which is, there's a variety of methods to measure muscle growth and muscle size, but generally something like an ultrasound or an MRI and so forth. A sport outcome, so that'd be stuff like how long did it take participants to sprint 20 meters, right? That's like a sporting type outcome, because it's not really a power outcome because there's technique involved, but it is relevant to sports. Then power outcomes that were a bit less skilled and a bit less directly relevant to sports. And then finally, body fat outcomes, which honestly, I just included because they were there. And I thought, hey, why not? But there's not enough data anyways to really form conclusions there. Anyways, when we grouped outcomes that way, what you see is that full range of motion outperformed partial range of motion for every single outcome, like muscle size, power, strength, and so forth. But that the difference between partial range of motion and full range of motion was again trivial. So a full range of motion can be a decent default approach if you want to see pretty good results in most things. So if you don't have any super specific goals, you're just training for general strength, hypertrophy, health, and so forth, a full range of motion might be a decent approach. Not just because it might, on average, all else being equal, be slightly better for muscle growth and so forth, but also because it's more easy to standardize, for example. Yeah. And so, especially if you've been training with a full range of motion already in the past, it can make it a lot easier to track progression, to make sure that you're training sufficiently hard now. Like for example, let's say you squatted 225 for 10 2 years ago with full range of motion, and now you're half squatting because you saw this meta-analysis and you think partials are where it's at. It can be difficult if you're not someone who's inclined to train hard enough. It can be difficult to make sure you're training hard enough. Whereas if you have that number staring at you, okay, I can do 225 for 10, you know, you have a benchmark. It can make it a lot easier to push yourself to at least, you know, within 5 reps of failure so that you can roughly maximize hypertrophy adaptation and so forth. Anyways, we then further broke it down into other analyses. So besides the main model, you can also perform 2 analyses called subgroup analyses, which are essentially just when you look at subsets of the data to figure out the answers to certain questions. And also regression analyses, which are essentially just looking at, okay, for example, as height changes, like if you put all the data of all participants into the model, do we see that the relationship between range of motion and adaptations changes as height changes? So for example, for shorter people, do we see that range of motion actually doesn't matter much, whereas for taller people, it might matter more. So we did all kinds of analyses. You can find all of them in the preprint, which is freely available. It's currently in publication, so hopefully it should be out within a few months as well. Anyways, subgroup analyses. One thing we looked at was whether or not range of motion was specific for strength and performance outcomes. What we did is we took outcomes and we grouped them by whether or not they were essentially biased towards a certain condition or group. For example, if in a study there were two groups, right? One group did a partial range of motion or half squats in their training program, and the other group did full range of motion or ass to grass squats, right? Because one group, the partial range of motion group, was training the partial squat directly as a skill, inherently, if the researchers were testing out partial range of motion or half squat on their max, that outcome was biased towards the half squat group because they were actually practicing the outcome itself. Yeah. And they were spending more time on average in the relevant muscle lengths with the relevant skill and so forth. And so when you group outcomes for performance that way, what you see is that generally speaking, if you train with a partial range of motion, you get better at partial range of motion than if you had trained with a full range of motion. If you train with a full range of motion, in general, on average, you get better at a full range of motion outcome than if you had trained with a partial range of motion. On the other hand, if the outcome is something different from what you've been training in the first place, for example, we have something in research called maximum involuntary contractions. That's a very unskilled test. And in these studies, no one performed them as part of the training. As part of the training, instead, they were doing like squats or bicep curls or skull crushers, what have you. When you use that as a performance test, oftentimes you don't see a difference between partial range of motion and full range of motion, which means specificity for strength, essentially, is quite important. It does seem like specificity applies to range of motion. So train within the same range of motion as the performance outcomes that you care about, whether that's a squat to parallel or a bench with an arch. You should probably spend at least a good deal of your training time training those directly rather than doing anything that's more partial than that or that's a longer range of motion than that. So specificity applies to strength and performance, which makes a lot of sense, but it's always nice to have those long-standing theorized principles, because ultimately like, specificity is derived from some studies that were established a few decades ago, and it's been assumed to an extent in everyone's minds that it's always true, right? Because it's a principle, but that principle is derived from certain studies, and so to see it confirmed is always a good thing. The next analysis I was personally quite interested in was looking at muscle length performed during partial range of motion conditions, right? So when you think about a partial range of motion, first of all, that's any range of motion less than a full range of motion, right? But a partial range of motion can be performed in a variety of ways, right? You can either perform it at the bottom of the bicep curl, for example, at longer muscle lengths, or at the top of the bicep curl, for example, at shorter muscle lengths. And generally, that does seem to influence how good a partial range of motion can be for hypertrophy. The results we found, and this isn't an analysis that had a ton of data, so I want to say it up front, if that was the only evidence I had, or we had, I guess, for long muscle lengths being productive for hypertrophy, I wouldn't be making much of a case for it because there's not that much data yet. But essentially what we found was a full range of motion outperformed partial reps at short muscle lengths for hypertrophy, which means doing a full range of motion bicep curl is probably better for hypertrophy than doing just the top portion during the whole set, right? On the other hand, the interesting thing is that doing partial range of motion repetitions at the bottom part of the bicep curl when the bicep is lengthened, that may actually be better for hypertrophy than doing full range of motion reps. And that it has likely to do with long muscle lengths being inherently productive for hypertrophy. So when you're doing a full range of motion rep, a solid maybe 50% of that set is spent at relatively shorter muscle lengths. Whereas with a partial range of motion long muscle length set, you would be spending essentially all of that set at longer muscle lengths, which likely is good for hypertrophy, but it's still unclear whether or not you should throw all of your training out the window and just do long muscle length partials. I think it's a bit too early to say that for sure, but it is worthy of consideration.
Yeah, and that was kind of the interesting finding there. But I think just to kind of sum that up real quick, like you said, full ROM is going to have like in the meta-analysis, you saw that full round was better than partial, but it was just a very small amount. It wasn't anything crazy, but you did see it be a little bit better. However, the big thing was, as you kind of looked into the research a little bit more, you found that the long muscle length particularly is where you see a lot of that hypertrophy, and that tends to be like, if you are going to do partials, that would ideally be where you would spend, most of your time, or where you're going to see more hypertrophy there with that.
Yep, you got it absolutely right.
So I think there was a couple studies in particular there that I know that are relatively recent there on that. I know one was the knee extension, I think was one that they did, and then the overhead for the triceps. Were those two that you guys included in that research as well too?
Yeah, so the leg extension one by Pedrosa and colleagues, we included that one. I talked about the overhead extension versus push down study by Milo et al., I think, in the discussion, but because it didn't involve two different ranges of motion being performed, it wasn't included in the analysis, because that was a study where they compared a partial range of motion at two different muscle lengths to each other, right? So that's why it wasn't included.
Got you. Cool. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because, like you said, it's kind of cool to hear that, like, okay, obviously, like you said, there's still research that needs to be done here with this, and there's not a ton of research on it yet, but it is kind of cool to know, like, which part of, if you are going to spend time doing partials, which part is going to be most important. So I guess to kind of dive into this a little bit more, is there any, and I think you guys kind of hit on this in the paper, is there any, like, I think a lot of the research in the past has been more on like lower body versus upper body, at least from what I read in there. Is this kind of muscle specific as well, do you think, or is that where we still need to find out a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so one thing that Brad Schoenfeld and his colleagues hypothesized a couple of years ago when they performed their systematic review on the range of motion literature as it was back then, was because there were 4 studies on the lower body at the time and 2 in the upper body, there just wasn't really enough evidence to see whether effects differed between upper and lower body. At the time, out of 4 studies, I want to say 3 studies were in favor of a full range of motion being better for hypertrophy in the lower body, and 1 found no difference. Whereas for the upper body, there was only 1 study in favor of full range of motion being better for hypertrophy, and the other one showed no difference. And so at the time, especially in the upper body, the evidence was a bit more mixed with regards to range of motion for hypertrophy. And so they theorized back then that the relationship between range of motion and hypertrophy might be different in certain muscle groups compared to others, specifically in the upper body compared to the lower body. We performed a subgroup analysis comparing all adaptations, so not just muscle hypertrophy, to be clear, but strength, power, muscle size, everything, in just the upper body and just the lower body to see whether or not there were some muscle group specific effects there. And long story short, not really. Like, the effects of a full range of motion versus a partial range of motion on adaptations seemed roughly the same, whether it was studied in the upper body or the lower body. So I wouldn't say we have sufficient evidence to say there's a difference between upper and lower body in terms of how it responds to range of motion.
And then I guess too, so you kind of mentioned, like long muscle lengths, being something that potentially is very important here. Would you say there's any potential like downsides to training mostly in long muscle lengths? Like, I think it sounds like, to me, anything that's like, oh, hey, this is good, this is going to be better, there's always some like inherent potential downsides that come with it. So I'm just kind of curious in terms of like, what would be maybe some downsides of keeping most of your training at long muscle lengths?
Yeah, so a few things, I guess, and they're relatively small downsides. So I think on average, it's still worth including them more than you were previously. But a few things would be, one, generally, when people have pre-existing injuries, they do tend to experience a bit more pain when they get to either extreme of the range of motion. So whether it's a full stretch or a peak contraction, generally, if you already have an injury, that can be a bit more painful, right? And maybe might aggravate pain for a little bit. So if you have a pre-existing injury, it might be worth not going ham with the long muscle lengths. Another one would be, as I mentioned earlier, standardization and tracking of progression. If you've been training with a certain range of motion for a while, some of the inherent benefit of continuing to train with that range of motion just lies in the ability to standardize it and track progression and make sure you're training sufficiently hard over time. Another one would just be preference. Some people don't like training with long muscle lengths, whether it's quote unquote ego lifting or being used to something. people have preferences, and that's understandable. Another one would be, let me think for a second. No, I think that's pretty much all of them.
What about on the fatigue side of things? Are you gonna did you notice too that like potentially you will find a little bit more fatigue that comes with like training at longer muscle lengths?
Absolutely. So that's actually the point I was going to bring up. So thank you for reminding me. There is some evidence suggesting that lower muscle lengths are inherently more fatiguing during resistance training than shorter muscle lengths. There's not a ton of data on this, and it is usually in relatively sterile environments. So what I mean by that is like, they're in the lab performing eccentric only contractions at long muscle lengths versus very short muscle lengths and seeing whether one is more fatiguing. And by fatiguing, oftentimes they're looking only at muscle damage, for example, which is only one part of the fatigue equation, I guess. But there is a potential that it's more fatiguing. Part of me thinks that might be in part due to just novelty, right? So when you're newly exposed to a training stimulus, that can be uniquely damaging. Whereas if you're exposed to it again, like a week from now and a couple of weeks from then, something is going to be protecting you called the repeated bout effect, which is essentially just saying when you repeatedly get exposed to a certain stimulus, your body's response to it, as far as muscle damage is concerned, decreases over time. So first time you train at very long muscle lengths, you might get really, really sore. Second time, you'll probably get meaningfully less sore and so forth until it's potentially about as fatiguing and damaging as most other muscle length training would be.
Yeah, and so I think kind of the reason that I wanted to bring that up too is because like I do, I think what this has shown is like training at a longer muscle length is probably going to be a little bit better for hypertrophy. But I think people hear that and then now they think that they just need to hammer away at that. And it's like, I do think there needs to be a little bit of caution there with that as well too. And then one thing that I also wanted to hit on that, and I think you might have kind of hit on this on the injury risk part of it, is can you potentially do too long of muscle length as well?
Yeah, so I think this is much more hypothetical than most people realize. And what I mean by that is, in theory, you could get to such a muscle length that your muscle would be in a very bad position to produce any active tension, right? So if you look at the length tension relationship of a muscle, or of the average muscle, you see that as they get lengthened and lengthened and lengthened, at some point, they're no longer really able to produce much active tension. However, I think in most practical situations, you don't really ever run into a muscle length that's that long, right?
Yeah.
Like for most exercises, I think your mobility constrains you before any sort of active tension consideration comes into place. For example, with a barbell squat, right? Even if you squat as low as you can, for a lot of people, that's not going to be that low in the first place.
Right.
Like they might get to around parallel, maybe slightly deeper. And even for people who can get lower than that, I'm still not sure there necessarily is a huge decrease in active tension, especially because there's a really easy way to tell that, right? And the easy way to tell that is how much less load do you need to use, right? If you need to use like disproportionately less weight on the bar to execute more range of motion at lower muscle lengths, then yeah, maybe you're running into a trade-off that isn't worth it. But I think generally, I haven't really ever met someone who like squats slightly deeper and loses like a ton of weight on the bar. When I have, most of the time, I think it is mostly just they have never squatted that low, so it's a new thing. But within a few sessions of doing that, the trade-off between load on the bar and extra range of motion at low muscle lengths is pretty linear or pretty consistent. And so I think in most practical situations, for most people, there really is no need to worry about losing active tension or getting outside of your active range of motion, especially to the extent that I see often done on Instagram nowadays. Like people saying they need to stay in their active range of motion, when in reality, they're doing a very partial range of motion and they could probably do like twice that almost and still be well within the active tension range of motion,
Yeah, no, that's a good point you bring up. Like you said, it's a little bit more hypothetical than anything. Cause like you said, there's going to be constraints to that anyways. Like you said, mobility, like, I'm thinking of like overhead tricep extension or something like that. It's like, your shoulder, I feel like is definitely at some point going to be the limiting factor there to where you can't just freaking stretch so much anyway. So no, that's a really good point there. So cool. So again, we know probably full ROM is going to be a little bit better than partial, but if you are going to do partials, long muscle length is going to be the way to go. Just obviously be careful with like just going ham with the long muscle lengths, as we know there's potentially a little bit higher fatigue, potentially maybe a little bit higher injury risk as well too. So I guess this goes, would there be a benefit to including some like short muscle length positioning into your training and like doing partials with that? Or
Yeah.
just doing short in general at really any point?
Sure. So there are a few benefits. Most of them are relatively marginal and hypothetical, I think. So if we're only talking about hypertrophy, right? Because with performance, it's pretty straightforward. If your performance outcome includes short muscle lengths,
right,
you do still want to be specific to that. With hypertrophy, however, there are a few reasons why you would want to include short muscle length specifically, right? So you wouldn't just want to do long muscle length partial reps. One would be potentially, and I'm skeptical on this reasonably, and I'll get to why, would be maximizing regional hypertrophy. So it's possible that the regional activation of a muscle changes depending on range of motion and the muscle length it's being trained at. So for example, at the very top of a squat, right, you might be using and activating different parts of your quads, glutes, and adductors than you are at the very bottom. And so if you're always skipping those muscle lengths, you may not get a good training effect in certain areas of your muscles, which then would lead to uneven muscle growth, or at least not as much muscle growth overall as you would have gotten if you train with a full range of motion. Now, I'm skeptical of this because as part of my reading of, I think there's about 9 studies comparing regional hypertrophy following training at different muscle lengths. What generally seems to be the case is that training at long muscle lengths optimizes hypertrophy at pretty much all sites, whether more distal or proximal. So a distal site, for example, would be the quads near the knee, right? Because your origin point for the quads, where it starts essentially, is near the hip, and the insertion point, or where the muscle ends, is near the knee. And so a distal point in that case would be near the knee, whereas a proximal point, or closer to your the midpoint of your body, would be near the hip, right? With long muscle length training, you see pretty uniform hypertrophy across both proximal and distal sites. Whereas with shorter muscle length training, you generally see pretty good hypertrophy proximally, so near the hip in this case, but relatively less hypertrophy distally. So I think generally there is the possibility that if you want to maximize uniform hypertrophy across the whole muscle, or if you specifically want to try and target one area of the muscle, being the proximal area, you might want to incorporate short muscle length training, at least to some extent. Another reason would be just injury. Oftentimes with injury, you have to do short muscle length training, and that's just how it is. You know, like if going deep into a squat hurts you, you might not really have much of a choice but to train with less range of motion, shorter muscle lengths to start off with at least. Another one is preference, once more. So we actually did also a survey and interview study on this stuff, where I asked people in the general population, just training for muscle hypertrophy and strength, what range of motion they use, why they use it, what informs the range of motion practice, why they don't use more or less range of motion, what sort of muscle length they train at, and so forth. And generally, most of the reasons for training a certain range of motion or a certain muscle length boils down to preference, habit, injury management, injury prevention, or perceived effectiveness. And so I think injury management and or prevention for some people can be part of it. Yeah, I think those are the main reasons why I would incorporate it specifically. I think generally biasing your training towards long muscle lengths makes sense, but there are some cases where you could argue for incorporating some short muscle length training.
Yeah, I mean, basically what I kind of heard there on it was like, again, this is probably why full range of motion is going to be beneficial, right? Because it's like you kind of mentioned some of the benefits of short, and it's just like, again, you can get both benefits by just training through a full range of motion most of the time. So a couple follow-up questions on this. Again, to go back to kind of what we talked about with length, and we talked about fatigue. Is this something where you might see a little less fatigue with shortened, or do we not really know on that?
Yeah, so that is possible. As I said earlier, not a ton of direct research on this, and the research we have isn't super ecologically valid.
Yeah,
but it is possible. And so I'm skeptical of this just because we have so much evidence at this point on hypertrophy and muscle length training. I'm somewhat skeptical on this, but it's possible that, you know, you get more fatigue with longer muscle length training, but you get a similar amount of stimulus in return. So yeah, all else being equal, you could just do more sets with a shorter muscle length to make up for not doing longer muscle lengths and have the same effect. But because of all of the evidence we have on longer muscle lengths for hypertrophy now, I'm talking the studies in the meta-analysis, so of which there are around like 10 maybe, comparing hypertrophy outcomes after longer versus shorter muscle lengths. There's 6 studies comparing a partial range of motion, so the exact same range of motion of, for example, 60 degrees around the elbow joint, but performed at different muscle lengths. So as you mentioned earlier, for example, the tricep extension study, where one group, or rather one arm, was doing pushdowns and the other arm was doing overhead extensions, where overhead extensions lengthen the long head of the tricep more as a result of the shoulder being more flexed. We have around 6 of those studies where the range of motion is the same, but the muscle length changes. And across 5 of those studies, they see a benefit of longer muscle length training for hypertrophy. One study found no difference. Then there's a bunch of evidence, like animal studies from back in the day, or even more recently, a study by Warnicki et al., which was a study where they gave participants an orthotic device, which is like a physical therapy type device, which stretched out their calves for an hour a day at a moderate intensity, but just one of their calves. And basically after 6 weeks of doing that, they saw pretty substantial hypertrophy of the calves. Then there's the older studies with animals, as I mentioned, where, for example, they weigh down birds' wings and they see hyperplasia, hypertrophy, good stuff happening. And finally, there's also the interset stretching data, where stretching between sets might be somewhat productive for hypertrophy. Altogether, I think when you take all of these studies, plus actually one more, which is isometric training data, we have 3 studies where people were either doing long muscle length isometric training or short muscle length isometric training. And after longer muscle length training, in all 3 studies, they saw more hypertrophy than with shorter muscle length training. So honestly, man, when you take all of that data combined, I do think there are edge cases where short muscle length training should be incorporated or even biased. But most of the time for hypertrophy, longer muscle lengths are what should be biased towards.
Cool. Yeah, no, that all makes sense. And I'm glad you brought up those studies too. And I think we're going to kind of switch over into the potential mechanisms as to why you think that it is better. But yeah, no, that was all super helpful. So again, they're really, in order, like you said, there might just be some very specific cases where you might want to incorporate some just short lengthen positioning. But if you want to go off the research, a lot of it is pushing towards lengthen is going to be better for hypertrophy. So cool. So let's dive into, I know you said you were going to have an article with Greg Nuckols coming out soon. I think you said it was going to be in Mass potentially as well,
Yes.
on Stronger by Science. And so mechanisms at play here as to why we are finding that longer muscle lengths are potentially better for hypertrophy.
Absolutely. Up front, I want to say that Greg Nuckols inspired all this. Like, he came up with a lot of this stuff. I was much more familiar with the direct evidence on hypertrophy itself than the mechanistic evidence. But now that we've discussed it to an extent, and I think it's a 40-page article total, so it's quite a long article. But now that I've discussed it with him to a pretty large extent, I can probably put forth some decent guesses.
Yeah.
So previously, my understanding, and I think a lot of people's understandings, were that the reason why longer muscle lengths are potentially better for hypertrophy is because of passive tension, right? So if you look at the length tension relationship chart, you see that as muscle length increases, so does passive tension. And if there's one thing we know about mechanisms for hypertrophy, it does seem like tension is the main mediator for hypertrophy. So tension is the main thing that would set off muscle hypertrophy. So that increase in passive tension could conceivably lead to more muscle hypertrophy following longer muscle length training when compared to shorter muscle length training. However, the issue here is that in a lot of these studies that directly compared shorter muscle length training to longer muscle length training, partial range of motion to full range of motion, where full range of motion usually leads to longer muscle lengths being trained, a lot of these studies just simply didn't allow for long enough muscle lengths to really see a buildup of passive tension to begin with. So it's questionable whether that small increase in passive tension would be sufficient to see a difference in hypertrophy, right? So that's thing number one. I think there's been other explanations put forward, such as hypoxia, for example. So in one study using skull crushers by Goto et al., that's GOTO, they also measured muscle oxygenation, and they found that when training at relatively lower muscle lengths, there was greater hypoxia or lack of oxygen in the muscle. And they hypothesized that the greater hypertrophy in the lower muscle length condition was due to more hypoxia, less oxygen in the muscle. But that's a mechanism that's really not very well evidenced for hypertrophy. So it's not clear that hypoxia leads to hypertrophy, for example. There's been a similar claim with lactate, where the lower muscle length condition in that study saw greater lactate, but that's also not super clear as far as hypertrophy is concerned. I think the main mechanism I can think of, to be honest, is very sort of mechanistic, right? So when you look at what actually senses tension within a muscle, you see a few things. There's a few different structures in a muscle that can sense the tension that they're being exposed to, so both passive and active tension. And some of them may be more responsive to feeling tension at lower muscle lengths, right? So when you're training, usually you expose your muscles to a certain amount of tension, they feel it, they initiate the hypertrophy response. But it seems like certain structures, specifically, I think they're called costomeres, those structures may be more sensitive to initiating hypertrophy when they both feel tension and when that tension is experienced at low muscle lengths. So when you're training with shorter muscle lengths, you might see that a lot of the structures feel the tension and signal hypertrophy, and you get some hypertrophy effect. However, on the flip side, when you're training with longer muscle lengths, you might get that effect, but in addition to that, you may also get the effect of certain structures like the costomeres I just mentioned, feeling that, but also feeling the effect of being at lower muscle lengths, which then adds up to the already present effect and overall produces more hypertrophy. I think that is a possibility. I think that's the most likely explanation we have so far for why long muscle length training is more productive for hypertrophy. But it is very much a question that's ongoing and we don't really have any direct evidence. I do think it is the most sort of intuitive explanation that would actually make sense given the data we have. Whereas, for example, as I mentioned, like the hypoxia data, the lactate data, the passive tension versus active tension data, none of that really makes a lot of sense when you consider everything together. One thing I wanted to say is that just like I mentioned that a lot of the range of motion and muscle length studies didn't actually have people train at super long muscle lengths, it's worth keeping that in mind when selecting exercises and training for hypertrophy. In these studies, longer muscle lengths were found to be more productive for hypertrophy, but that doesn't mean the longest muscle lengths, right? Because in pretty much none of these studies did they ever have participants train at like, a super big deficit RDL or an ass to grass squat. Oftentimes it was a comparison of like a half squat to a squat to just below parallel. And generally it might be the case that you need long enough muscle lengths, and it may be better to train at as long a muscle length as you can for hypertrophy. But I think potentially most of the benefit of longer muscle lengths for hypertrophy comes from training at sufficiently long muscle lengths, not at maximally long muscle lengths. And so, yeah, I think that is essentially our current understanding of why longer muscle lengths may be better for hypertrophy and the mechanisms behind that.
Cool. No, that's super helpful. And I think that's going to be, I'm assuming that's probably something that will probably start to get maybe a little bit more traction here moving forward in terms of the research. But I also like that you brought up the fact that you mentioned, again, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to get into these super extreme range of length and positions. It's just like you said, you just need to make sure it's good enough, right? And you're not stopping yourself short. And like you said, half squat. Like I think again, that's where a lot of people can get confused and think, oh, they have to do this like super range of motion, like squat or something like that. Like you said, ass to grass. And it's like you don't have to go that far. So I think that's super helpful there. Cool.
Yeah.
So
just to clarify real quick, I do think there is a potential benefit for longer muscle lengths, right? Like maybe you do see a roughly linear relationship between muscle length and hypertrophy, but there are diminishing returns.
Okay.
So that's not super clear yet because in part it hasn't been directly studied. Like you don't see studies comparing ass to grass squats to below parallel squats,
right?
Because it just doesn't happen. And one correction I want to put forth is I got confused earlier. I meant titin. So costomeres do initiate hypertrophy as well with tension, but titin is the protein that both senses tension and also senses increases in muscle length.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, and that makes sense. That's like you said. They right now there's just no direct evidence of comparing, like you said, ass to grass to like a further more than parallel squat. Cool. So I guess then to kind of follow up question on this, what do you like? Is there anything on your end where you're very interested in kind of taking the next step with the research? Is there anything like maybe in the works as well, where you kind of see this headed over the next little bit?
Yeah, so there's a few things I'd be interested in seeing with the research. The first one would be comparing very long muscle length conditions to relatively long muscle length conditions. Because as you mentioned, there's two possibilities here, right? And they might not be mutually exclusive. One is that longer muscle lengths, like maximally long, are just sort of better than just long muscle lengths. So as you get longer and longer muscle lengths, hypertrophy just steadily increases. It's a possibility. At the same time, with some of the stuff we mentioned earlier, with as muscle length gets too long, active tension might start to drop off. With that being the case, it's possible that actually you see a sort of inverted U relationship with muscle length and hypertrophy, just like with volume and many other variables, where pretty long muscle lengths are good for hypertrophy, but then past that point, you see a decrease again of hypertrophy, such that when you get too long, active tension drops off, and the hypertrophy effect you get out of that set decreases again. It's possible, but I'd like to have more evidence on that front, because until then, my recommendation is just train with as long a muscle length as you can. And that's like a good, safe bet for now, I think. But it's possible that we actually need to do less than that, or we really need to emphasize that even more. Another one is, in general, isometric long muscle length contraction data. So nowadays, there's been plenty of evidence on full range of motion versus partial range of motion. There's been plenty of evidence of even partial ranges of motion at different muscle lengths. But isometric contractions, so that's essentially like a zero range of motion rep, that hasn't really been directly studied a ton. So as I mentioned earlier, I think there's been 3 studies comparing isometrics at different muscle lengths, but there haven't been that many studies to my knowledge comparing, for example, an isometric at long muscle lengths to a partial at long muscle lengths, or to a full range of motion repetition, and so forth. And so that's actually my third point, and the final one. I want to see a direct comparison of different contraction modes. So for example, do concentric contractions inherently, or rather, do dynamic contractions like concentric plus eccentric inherently grow more muscle than isometric contractions, where you're staying at the same muscle length the whole time? I think that's a question that is often assumed is already answered, right? Because mechanistically, eccentric contractions might stimulate hypertrophy in a different way from concentric contractions. And so hypothetically, by including all contraction modes at once, like concentric, eccentric, and maybe isometrics, you would see the greatest hypertrophy effect. But while everyone just sort of knows intuitively at the back of their minds that, hey, we do dynamic contractions because they're better for hypertrophy than isometric contractions, it's not something that's been systematically reviewed yet, like in any real way, shape, or form. And so something we're actually working on now, very slowly, admittedly, because as I said earlier, quite busy at the moment, but we're looking at taking all of the studies that compared, for example, just isometric to just eccentric, or just concentric to just eccentric, any combination of contraction modes, and how they stacked up in terms of hypertrophy response. Because we want to see, okay, people always say isometrics are worse for hypertrophy, so we don't do them. Like, for example, a wall sit is generally avoided for hypertrophy. But is there a possibility that it's just as good for hypertrophy, or even better than a dynamic contraction? Because essentially at that point, you're spending all of the set at quote unquote the optimal muscle length, if there is such a thing. So it's a question we've been interested in for a while, and it's something that I'd like to get an answer to within the next year or so.
Awesome. Yeah, I think all those would be super helpful. And I know that a lot of this research is starting to come out in the last couple of years with all this too. So it's something that, and I feel like with this type of stuff, it's like once it kind of gets rolling, it's like just freaking stuff just gets hammered out with it. So I'm sure that will all be stuff that we'll be able to find out hopefully fairly quickly. And I also think too, you kind of mentioned earlier on, like, again, what's kind of like the optimal long muscle length there? Like, is there that point where it's too much? Kind of like you said, that inverted U, just like with volume and stuff like that. I wonder too, a big role in that probably is going to be like, if you go so long through range of motion or lengthen, it's like weight, like the amount of weight that you can do is going to have to go down at some point as well too. And I'm sure that's going to play at least somewhat of a role there in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we need more evidence on in general, is how much of a role does active tension play as muscle length increases? Because there's a possibility, as I said, like when you get to too long of a muscle length, active tension drops off so much that it's no longer worth the additional muscle length and potential signaling that occurs within muscle cells.
Cool. Awesome. So I think this was a great, like, just summary of where the research is at, what everything, where everything's pointing right now. And so I guess maybe to kind of leave the audience here, what would be some maybe just kind of practical applications with range of motion training right now for muscle growth? I think that's probably what people are going to be most intrigued by.
For sure. So there's a few. I would say generally, bias most of your exercise selection and technique towards the longer muscle lengths. So for example, if you're currently pausing a ton at short muscle lengths, like for example, during a machine chest fly, right? If you're pausing at the peak contraction, I would probably advise against that.
Okay.
Because that essentially means that you're spending proportionally more of your set at shorter muscle lengths, which are probably worse for hypertrophy than spending more of your set at longer muscle lengths. So that's one tweak. So do more pauses at long muscle lengths and fewer of them at short muscle lengths. Another one would be exercise selection wise. I think most of your exercises should include long muscle lengths. So for example, you probably shouldn't do a ton of tricep kickbacks, right? So not only should your exercises mostly include long muscle lengths, but they should also mostly be reasonably challenging at long muscle lengths. So for example, with a cable row or like a dumbbell row, I guess, you do see relatively long muscle lengths, a good stretch, so it's a decent exercise. At the same time, it's not that challenging at long muscle lengths. So if you have the choice between a dumbbell row and a prime row, for example, where you can specifically load the lengthen position, that might be one case where one exercise is likely better than the other for hypertrophy. You can, however, and this brings me to my next point, make up for some of these limitations in equipment and exercise selection with both pauses, as I mentioned, making it more challenging or spending more time proportionally in that muscle length, and also something I like to call stretched supersets or lengthened supersets, which is essentially when you take a full range of motion set to or close to failure, however you want to play that, and then instead of just resting and doing another set in a few minutes, you continue that set, but this time doing half reps in the lengthened position. So for example, with a dumbbell row, like I mentioned earlier, you'll do full range of motion reps, touching your chest on every rep until you say got 2 reps in the tank. And then instead of putting the dumbbells down, you keep going, but this time only doing the first half of the concentric where your lats, rhomboids, lower traps, mid traps, etc. are still pretty lengthened. And you keep pumping out reps until probably a similar RPE or reps in reserve, maybe around 2 reps in reserve. And then you put down the weight and rest until your next set. I think the pauses, so switching out pauses in the peak contraction for in the peaks or the stretched out position, selecting the right exercises. So I would say generally, I do still incorporate some quote unquote shortened bias exercises, like for example, some spider curls or some lying-like curls and so forth. I do incorporate some of those in my program, but generally the split is something like 70-30, 70 lengthened emphasis, or maybe even 80, and then 20 to 30% shortened emphasis or no real emphasis, because some exercises are pretty well balanced as far as that goes. So I think those would be the main takeaways I would suggest.
Awesome. Yeah, super helpful there. I also like the advice on the stretch supersets, pauses, and like the back example. I think that's great. And again, just gets a little bit more out of it, because in a row like that, I guess you probably your limiting factor is going to be being able to get the weight all the way up. So it's like you might as well get a little bit more out of that set there and get something, like you said, lengthen. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, Milo, I appreciate your time. Is there anywhere where you, I guess where can the audience find like more kind of just information on this specific topic, and where can they find more about you in general?
Yeah, so the main place to find more information on the topic would likely be, as a starting point, For now, the meta-analysis, which I'm sure will be linked in the description, it's free to access, so you don't need to pay for it. You don't need any sort of access. You can just open it and read it, and that'll give you a good starting point. In the future, there will be the SBS article out, which hopefully should be a decent resource as well for range of motion related stuff. It goes through both the meta-analysis itself, but also then hypothesizes on mechanisms why certain things might be better than others. And then as far as finding me, I'm on Instagram at Wolf Coach. So that's my last name, Wolf and Coach, with an underscore at the end. I am also on YouTube. So I've started a podcast recently called Muscle and Feels as an homage to the Muscle and Fitness magazine. And then finally, you can also find my coaching stuff, my website and so forth at wolfcoaching.net. And then finally, I guess, actually finally this time, I'm also a coach for Stronger by Science at the moment. So if you want coaching, you can either go through my personal website or you can go to strongerbyscience.com/coaching and get some coaching from there.
Awesome. Ton of great information on here. I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing, what comes out over the next little bit as well too. So great chat, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you, man.